Hi all, welcome back to Adobe Live Pro Tips. It's been an exciting day. We've been exploring quite a bit about Photoshop already, all of Monday and Tuesday with some really special launches. I hope you've been keeping up. And today we're actually going to be exploring a little bit more about Photoshop, and we're going to be exploring gradients. So if you've seen gradients all over the internet, they are quite popular today. Actually, when I got started, they were a big no-no because we didn't quite know how to experiment with them. So oftentimes they didn't tend to turn out really fun. So today we're gonna learn a little bit about gradients, but also a few applications that are a bit more practical for your uses. My name is Cyn Lagos. I am a graphic designer, photographer, aspiring filmmaker, and I love mentoring artists like yourselves here online live streams. And I love to share with you my website where I like to share any of these streams so that you can restream them at your own pace whenever you have a chance to. We've done a couple here exploring Adobe Express, Lightroom, and now Photoshop. So hopefully you've been able to keep up with the latest streams. If not, they're available here whenever you feel kind of in tune to learn a little something. So let's jump into Photoshop. All right, so we're in Photoshop and I've already gone ahead and set up my files here. If you're not familiar with working with artboards, it's one of my favorite things because it allows me to experiment quite a bit in several artboards without having to open several files. So I've set up different artboards here so we can keep ourselves organized. We're going to explore gradients and there are different functions, right? So if you're familiar with gradients, perhaps you're familiar with one or two of the places you can find them in. You can find them in quite a few places actually. So actually, let me open this cursor up before I forget. There you go. All right. So you can find the gradient tool right here on your left-hand side on your sidebar. That is a pretty easy way to find it. But there's also a few other ways to locate gradient. You can also locate a gradient down here, and you'll find elements like gradient and also gradient map all the way down here, right? So there are several ways. There's also within the properties panel, you can find different ways to modify that gradient. So if some of these look a little bit different, that's probably why. Okay, so let's get started here. I want to talk about why gradients could be useful. So in my case, I find that gradients are often a really great way to emulate light and dimension. So I'm going to go into this section here, into this artboard. I'm going to click here real quick so I can find myself. Oh, there you are. All right, so I'm going to go into this artboard, and like I think it's yesterday, but it was Monday. Like Monday, we like to create a background that is a little bit darker just to get a sense of the light that's going to come through, because gradients give you a sense of light and dimension. So we're going to fill this with black. So I'm going to just hit Command Backspace to fill it in. And I'm going to create another layer in here. And I'm going to go into a different way of approaching gradients is to double click and find your layer styles, and you're going to find the gradient overlay. But first, let's set something up here. We're going to actually go into the first tool we talked about, which is on the sidebar. And we're going to have this really neat tool. It's a way to just drag the gradient into your layer. So you can see that depending on how far you drag that line, it really changes the way that gradient is being applied. So I have already a pre-selected color here. I have this purple hue. And when you click on the gradient editor, you can find that you can switch any of these color palettes into something maybe a little bit darker, something like this, and then something like this. And you have all of these other presets already established that have a good number of combinations of gradients. I like gradients that have at least 2 to 3 colors. And if you want to go crazy, you can always add a few more little squares here and adapt new color palettes. I think a good rule is to know that each edge is determining the shadows, the highlights, and then the middle is the midtones. So that is the way it's going to be applied into your gradients. So maybe we add one more color here. All right, and you can see here also that as they combine together, they also blend together. So it creates a bit of a different hue when it combines that yellow with that blue together. And the same happens with this dark purple and the yellow. It kind of creates a bit of a muddy color because those two don't combine so well, but that's okay. We like this color palette. We're going to move on with it. And now when I apply it, you can see those colors being applied. Now you'll notice something that in this case, this color is being applied, this gradient is being applied as a linear gradient, right? So there's different formats for you to explore. So if I was to jump in here, I can also modify the different ways that color is applied. So let me go into the regular gradient, right? So up here you have options of classic gradient and the new gradient. And in here, we're going to find those options, the radial gradient, a diamond, a sort of reflective gradient. So the reflective gradient is kind of cool. It does this. So it starts sort of from the center and it goes out. That's pretty neat, right? So I think I'm going to go with that option. And that kind of determines the shape of that gradient. So I'm going to convert this into a smart object, which we learned is a really non-destructive way to modify your elements without being non-destructive. You can always go back. All right, I'm going to hit shift here to just modify that a little bit to make it a little bit skinnier. Actually, I had another layer here at the bottom. That's okay. All right, I'm going to merge these two by hitting Command E. And I'm going to go into the filter gallery and go into one of my favorites, which is liquify. It lends for some really cool warpy kind of results, experimental results, and I'm just going to mess with it here. I can tell here my artboard is a little bit bigger, but that's okay. Most of the artwork that I'm going to be working on is going to show up on my regular artboard too, so it'll be fine. All right, so let's modify this a little bit, and this is kind of the fun part because you can just play with it as much as you want, and that's looking pretty swell. I feel like just approaching it from being more experimental and doing some swirls, it ends up looking really, really gnarly. All right, I'm gonna go into this and add a noise to give it a cool sort of analog effect to it. And I'm gonna make sure that is a monochromatic noise, so it doesn't add any other colors. And that's how our gradient is looking. And now this is a pretty cool gradient to play with if you want to add it to your backdrops, into your posters, if you want to play with adding it into text, which we will get to in a minute. All right, let's try a different gradient here. In this case, I'm going to have this black background, and I'm going to pull the gradient from this section, which we just talked about. So we're going to create a gradient map this time. So let's go into gradient map. And right now it's a gray, it's a black, gray to white gradient. So it's one of our basic gradients. We're going to double click on this gradient, or this gradient up here, and it's going to bring the gradient editor. All right, let's go into a fun color, maybe something in the orange section. Yeah, there you are. All right, so I like colors like this, and you can see the predominant color right now is yellow because it's one of it's the darker color, right? So the shadows, and our previous layer is a shadow color, right? I mean, it's a complete black hue. If it was a white hue, then the highlight color would be represented a lot more. I'm gonna add a few more colors here to kind of create a variation. And I love the way this combines. You can start pulling this lever a little bit more to create more predominance on the shadows or the highlights. And you can keep playing here with different variations. I feel like when you create a few colors that are close together in the tone or the tint, but not the hue, it looks good together. So all pastels or something very kind of on the darker side, it tends to blend together fairly well. So I'm going to do something like this. I feel like maybe this color should be a little bit darker, to be honest. Let's do something like a red. Color hues are always kind of a peculiar thing to pick on the go. All right, let me try. Let's try that. Let's see what happens when we do that. Nice. So let's do this color hue, but before I move on, I'm actually going to create a new preset of this selection so that I don't lose track of it. And you can tell I can just do that by writing out a name, new gradient. So this is how we would create a preset of our gradient. And in our selected folder, it's going to then include that gradient. Okay, I could have selected it first and then written the name. There you go. And select new, and it's going to be applied. So now I can find it a little bit easier and also modify if I need to. All right, so now that I've done that, I'm going to add a new layer beneath, almost sandwiched between these two, the gradient map and the black layer. And we're going to grab a brush and start painting. Now, when we start painting, you can determine the size of the brush. Let's lower that a little bit and start creating these really neat combinations. And that is picking up from the gradient map that we decided to do, that we just selected, that you couldn't see it. It wasn't visible before, but because I'm painting with white, which is the highlights, now it's going to be fairly visible. I'm going to change this gradient. This is one of my favorite things, is that you can always go back and modify colors. Something darker, because we're not working destructively. Back to that layer. And it's really, really cool. And something I really like about it, I'm going to delete that layer so I can show you a few more examples of that. Something I really like about this is that when you're brushing here, this is a very cool way to create maybe neon letters, something really cool here. I'm doing this with my mouse, so you can create some really cool neon lettering just by determining the shadows and highlights and creating this really neat effect. You can also create your own pattern, your own texture here, right? There's just so much room for cool gradient effects that can end up being a really nice backdrop or simply a really cool pattern for you to use in the future to keep in your libraries. I know I create those all the time. It's one of my favorite things to do. So now we have two gradients on the go. Awesome. So now let's talk about some other practical ways, because this is kind of one of them, as a poster, as a background. Other practical ways of using a gradient, one that I find myself using quite a bit when it comes to gradients. So I'm going to pull up an image I took here, a self-portrait, and you can see here we have this image in full color, right? So we can jump into Lightroom and modify this image into a new hue, or we can actually come in here and start playing with a gradient map. So again, I already actually have a gradient map here because I was playing around earlier, but let's delete it. I'm going to show you how to do that. All right. Gradient map directly from here. And right away, I have my basic black to white color gradient, but I actually want something different. I do want this black and white, but you can see how the highlights are being represented sort of in this like very, it's an interesting duotone, but it's a very strange like X-ray element, which could be nice and experimental. I'm all for it. But let's see what would happen if I modify this and switch it to the other side. You can see the whites are extremely white. Maybe it's a matter of determining a different black and white hue. And this is cool because it sort of creates that black and white effect, and you have a little bit more control on where each thing lands. By the way, if a new cube arrives here where like you clicked it and it appeared, you can just drag it down and it'll be gone. See that? Or you can add a separate color and start creating this like duotone effect to your image. In this case, I actually want the black and white, so I'm going to keep it this way. Let's just drag this over a little bit more. Something like there. Okay. Hit OK. Awesome. Now I want to select the background. So just like that, we created a filter for our image. And in that same fashion, we can also create a different duotone color palette if we decided to make one of these a different color palette. Let's say maybe something like this. Now we have a duotone filter right away from our gradient maps, which I think it's pretty neat. All right, we're gonna go back to the black and white so I can show you another really cool practical way to use gradients in a fashion that it emulates depth and also lighting, right? Lighting, like if you're in a studio lighting, which is, I think it's kind of interesting to do in post. So let's go into this selection tools to just select my object. Now with the power of AI, we can pretty much select this object or myself. I'm not an object, but still myself fairly quickly. And I'm just going to mask it with this icon right here at the bottom. I'm actually going to bring this icon here so you can see a little bit better. All right, that looks good. And you can see that I masked this entire scene. Even the hair is masked. So good. Awesome. Saving us time so we can play around and experiment a little bit more. All right, so this black background is a little too solid for me. It's not creating that depth as if I'm in a studio with a background. It's not quite doing that for me. So I'm going to grab the gradient tool, go back to a gradient that is a basic color, and start creating a linear gradient in this case. Something like this. I'm going to do it down here. And I'm just going to double click here so that gradient is in fact, here we go. Several double clicks to find our gradient editor from this far out. But we're going to go into the white section and make it a little bit of a gray. Something like this. So it emulates a little bit of depth, but it's not a stark contrast of white and black. I think that should be okay. Let's see how that's looking. The blending should be very smooth. So I want to make sure that's working out pretty well. Maybe right there. And we can also determine the angle of this lighting. So if there was, in fact, a source light from the left, it would be an angle that is coming from the left, the highlights coming from the left, and the shadows are coming from the right. But in this case, I actually want the shadow to be a little bit lower, like this. And I'm just going to pull this lever so the light is something like that. All right. Where are we here? Okay. Now we're going to create a new shape. And this is how you add gradients to a shape. We're just going to create a simple circle here. And with this circle selected, we're going to remove the stroke if you got one. We're going to go into fill, and you notice that we also have these other options in here. Another place where you can find your gradient. So we have this gradient selection here, and we're going to fill our I think I'm below a gradient map. I'm going to raise it to the top. There you are. Let's convert this to a smart object. There you go. All right, so let's put this layer behind it. There you go. So now it's not being affected by that gradient map. Nice. Now we're going to go in here, and one more thing we're going to do is we're going to change this to a radial gradient so that it's coming from the center. You can see that the colors are coming from the center and they're going outwardly, right? So as I do that, I want to make sure that that's actually emulating light on the edges. At the moment, the brightest color is actually on the outside, but that's not how light actually creates it diffuses sort of at the end, right? So I want to make sure that that is the brightest color. So I'm going to switch this to something a little bit brighter, maybe something like this. And I'm going to do the shadows, that kind of pink hue that we had earlier, but still blending together, not too far off, right? So I'll pick a color with my eyedropper right there and see how far we can make it here. Nice. Let's go to a pastel sort of hue. I like that. There you go. That's what I wanted. And I'm just going to drag my buttons here a little bit so that circle is a bit wider. Nice. And now you can see there, we've created that shape. Nice. All right. Now that we've done that, we're going to place it to the back of my cutout selection. And we're going to go into blur, filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And it asks me to convert to smart object. Yes, please. And you can see how that starts to create this sort of light bulb effect, as if I created a light. I had a light in Studio. And of course, there's a little bit of TLC that's required for it to really come together, but you can start to see that effect already. I'm going to create another one of these and maybe place it more in the center there. And the one in the back, we're going to blur even more so. So another Gaussian blur. You can always just repeat the last action that's right here. And increase that quite a bit so it expands. And let's see what it would look like once we start playing with some blending tools. So something like lighten or screen, maybe overlay. I think hard light is definitely creating that effect a little bit better. Nice. So now we have hard light creating this really neat effect. Like I had lighting behind me. And to create more of that depth, I'm actually going to create a new layer and start to and create another gradient in front of it. But this time, this gradient is going to be a transparent gradient. So it's going to look like this. And you can see the top is not it doesn't have anything on it. It just has one single color, right? We're going to switch that color to, all right, we're going to switch that color to a black. And now that's starting to create a little bit more of that depth. And I think that's looking a little bit more like there's a spacing and we have that dimension going on. I'm going to hit multiply, maybe overlay for this one. Yeah, overlay looks better. And we'll finalize this with another gradient map at the very top. And we're going to do a fun one, a fun color here, maybe one of these blue hues. And change the blending mode or the opacity. And just like that, we applied gradients to create a sense of depth, a sense of duotone, filters. I mean, there's a lot of practical options here when it comes to utilizing gradients for your photography and also just experimenting with that depth of light in post-production, which could often be a way to kind of save you from, hey, I didn't use that lighting that I wanted to, but maybe this is a place that I can do it. So I'm going to play with blending as we have a few last minutes here. In text, we apply our gradient in a similar fashion, but this time we're actually going to go and double click on the text. And we're going to find our gradient in a different place. We're going to find it within our layer styles. And we're going to click select. And you can see there's already a really nice duo gradient with two colors of of the same hue, but a different tint, right? So we have a tint here and we have a tone here, which has black, one has white. And you can start to see that this is already, because we've been talking about linear, radial, you can start to see that this just visibly has a linear gradient. And in fact, it does, right? So we have a linear gradient here, a -38 angle. So the shadows are coming from the left. Okay, that's important to note because we're going to go to the background of this layer, and we're going to create another gradient. So we're going to create a gradient coming from here. And this time we'll double click that, gradient overlay. And now we're going to just switch it. So now we create this really neat effect of blending text and backgrounds and the opposite lighting. So hopefully y'all enjoy this. I'll see you on the next round of Photoshop Pro Tips.